I'm delighted to welcome you to our O'Reilly Theatre for this lecture in celebration of Ralph Walter's legacy endowment of a new chair in modern British political history. Ralph, for those of you who don't know him, is loved in two colleges in Oxford, both for his company and his generosity. He's an alumnus of Kellogg, and I'm delighted that the current president of Kellogg, Jonathan Mickey, is with us this evening, and indeed the founding president of Kellogg is also with us. So you're both very welcome. But Ralph has more recently formed an association with Keble also in developing the Centre for Research in Victorian Political Culture, which in a few months' time will be housed in our wonderful new H.B. Allen Centre. So, Ralph, the first thing to do on my part is to thank you very warmly on behalf of the college for this legacy bequest, which will link a new university professorship with Keble. We are delighted, and I know, and it's clear from the presence in the audience tonight of the Head of Humanities Division, Professor Karen O'Brien, and the Chair of the History Faculty, Professor Martin Conway, that I speak for the university as well. It's a tremendous thing that you've done, and we are extremely grateful for it. Professor William Whyte is an expert, as many of you know, on social and architectural history. He is also, it has to be acknowledged in these surroundings, a fellow. Indeed, he's vice president of St John's College. And it therefore has to be taken on trust by the members of Keble that he is not here as a member of the society founded in the early days of our existence in St John's by the men of St John's, the Destroy Keble Society. The prime purpose of which was to demolish the wonderful architecture which Butterfield had designed, brick by brick. I have to say that anyone who has seen the YouTube video introduction to the architecture of Keble, which William presents, will know that I need have absolutely no fears on that score. He is a true friend of Keble, and we are delighted, William, that you're giving this celebratory lecture. Keble, Oxford, Britain and the World. I went on to wonder whether that was going to go on and say a new proposal for a customs union or some such. But no, it's the different scales of modern history. William, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation to come here. Thank you to Ralph for this amazingly generous gift, for providing the occasion for this celebration, and thank you very much for coming. We're here, as we just heard, to commemorate a wonderful benefaction for Keble, of course, for Oxford, and for the study of modern British history more generally. And we're here not just to commemorate that, but also to give thanks for that. And it seems reasonable, as the thing that has brought us here is a benefaction, to start by looking back at earlier benefactions to this college, earlier benefactions in Keble's past. Not, I think, to the first great campaign for funds, the campaign for funds in the 1860s to found the college, a campaign which yielded tens of thousands of pounds, donated by no fewer than 3,000 separate donors, a campaign that was successful despite the doubts expressed by at least one supporter, and I quote, that no one would be willing to give to the rich University of Oxford. An anxiety of the 1860s, an anxiety now. No, what I want to begin with, which is what was for a very long time the single biggest donation Keble ever received, the money given by William Gibbs to build the chapel. Gibbs's donation of £40,000 in the 1870s was, in fact, probably the single largest donation made to any of the colleges of Oxford in the 19th century, and £40,000 was only a few thousand less than had gone to build and establish the whole of the rest of the college. It's fair to say that the celebrations on the opening of this chapel on St. Mark's Day, on the 25th of April, 1876, were somewhat different from what we're experiencing at the moment. It was marked by no fewer than 2 sermons, 3 religious services, half a dozen half-hour-long speeches, and throughout the whole of the day, a collection box was passed amongst the attendees, which yielded an offertory of no less than £853. We're doing none of that this evening, you'll be glad to hear. It's also worth remarking, as the warden suggested, that not everyone wholly approved either of the nature or of the form that this benefaction took. The Building News, in its review of Keble Chapel, simply called it a holy zebra. The High Church journal, The World, dismissed its, and I quote, unspeakable ugliness. The other religious journal, The Hour, observed that it was, and I quote, externally a hideous building, vividly suggestive of a workhouse or county lunatic asylum. Notably, remarkably, in his lengthy hour-long sermon at the opening service, Keble's friend and fellow tractarian, Edward Pusey, failed to mention the architecture at all. He hated it. He had hoped for a nice, neat stone structure and not the bricky building which eventuated. At my own college, as we just heard, the reaction to Keble Chapel, to Keble College, was more than mere silence. The college had sold this site on the condition that Keble promised, on the one hand, not to drag down property values, and on the other hand, not to teach anything hostile to the established church. It's a very St. John's thing to do there, if you think about the order of priorities, in which we think about finance and then maybe God. It was a good deal for the college. Indeed, the then president of St. John's, attended the opening of the chapel. The students, however, as we heard, were much less impressed. This is the opening. The Destroy Keble Society was, as I understand it, a very real thing, and of course would give birth in the 1970s to the Keble Protection Group, who are responsible for this graffito still there in Blackhall Road. But doubts aside, it was a day of real celebration in that April of 1876, a day in which the great and the good and the simply grand gathered together to mark this marvellous benefaction and this extraordinary building, the crown of Keble's architecture. Half a dozen bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Chancellor of the University, Lord Salisbury, half of Oxford, a third of the Cabinet, and much of the House of Lords were packed in to the building to mark the occasion. And they did so, of course, against the backdrop not merely of excitement and anticipation in Oxford and in Britain as a whole. They did so against the backdrop of what has sometimes been seen as the apogee of British history, a period, the mid to late 19th century, that can be understood, that was understood by many contemporaries and by still more subsequent historians, as the moment of Gloriana, the moment in which Britain, in the title of David Canadyne's recent history, a victorious century. And here is the victory at that time. 1876, the year the chapel opened, was, of course, and indeed April was the month in which Queen Victoria also became Empress of India, lured into that oriental role, that imperial role by Disraeli. Britain in 1876 was still the single largest industrial nation, commercial nation, trading nation, imperial nation in the world. And more than that, Britain in 1876, its government, its constitution and its parliament appeared to be the cynosure of all Europe and beyond, especially after the events in France of 1870 and 71, where the Paris Commune seemed proof of the failure both of continental absolutism and continental democracy alike, as well as evidence of the fundamental flaws in French national character, especially when compared to the British. The, and I quote, spontaneous generation of irrationality and passion which rapidly grows to absolute lunacy, which Fraser's magazine observed and condemned in the French people in 1871. Not coincidentally, the 1870s, this period of imperial, commercial, industrial, and political apogee, this was also the period that would see the creation of the Oxford School of Modern History, as we now know it. William Stubbs, its creator, became Regius Professor of Modern History in 1867, and by 1872, just after Keble opened and just before the opening of the chapel, in other words, the separate honour school of modern history was created. And Stubbs, it's worth remarking, turned up at the opening of the chapel in 1876, attended the dinners, and also presumably contributed to the collection. At the core of Stubbs's course of the Oxford School of Modern History as it was created in 1872 was, of course, the story of English history, and more particularly the story of England's constitutional development. Stubbs's books, his select charters, his constitutional history, not only provided, as contemporaries put it, a strength and dignity to the School of Modern History which it would otherwise have lacked, these books also articulated the underlying rationale for the study of history in Oxford, the study of English political institutions, the examination, as Stubbs himself put it, of a distinct growth from a well-defined germ to full maturity, a growth whose life and developing power lies deep in the very nature of the English people. This was an explicitly Christian, indeed as James Kirby has recently shown, an explicitly high church model, not unlike the ideals which animated the founding of Keble. This was an explicitly nationalist ideal, one that celebrated the inherent qualities of the English nation and the British race, and one, as James Campbell once observed, that was, and I quote, consistently anti-French, regarding France as originally and essentially absolutist. Above all, of course, this was a fundamentally political history, a history, in Tennyson's frequently quoted words, of a land of settled government, a land of just and old renown, where freedom slowly broadens down from precedent to precedent. Keble, then, the Keble of the 1870s, its chapel, opened in 1876, is a monument to a moment in British history and a monument to a moment in British historiography, a time in which history seemed to explain and to justify Britain's status as the preeminent commercial power and as the great global exemplar of good government, a time in which it seemed self-evident to many that the proper subject of British historians was British history and the proper study of history was politics. Edward Freeman, Stubbs's successor as Regius Professor and another great Tractarian historian, made the point most pointedly in his much repeated aphorism, history is past politics and politics present history. Now, these assumptions would prove extraordinarily long-lasting, surviving the dissolution of the empire and outliving the commercial supremacy which seemed to justify them. Arguably, they would last a whole century from the 1870s to the 1970s. The jokes made by two previous Oxford undergraduates in 1066 and all that, published in 1930, were still funny decades later because the course they were satirising was still very much the same. The core of the Oxford Modern History School for a century remained constitutional history, and the central focus was on England's particular political development. As Josie Harris writes in her contribution to the history of the University of Oxford, and I quote, "The review section of the Oxford magazine in 1954 welcomed a monograph on the late Lancastrian receipt of the Exchequer as a major event, but dismissed the current interest in American history as a fashionable craze. As late as the 1970s, indeed, as my colleague Peter Ghosh once observed, it was, and I quote, still taken for granted in Oxford that modern English history was the crown of the historical profession. Moreover, the nature of that British history was, 40 years ago, in many respects, still seen as self-evident. As Peter Ghosh and Lawrence Goldman noted in their Festschrift for Colin Matthew, the 1970s was, and again I quote, the last time, either in academic life or in the wider public culture of the United Kingdom, that British political history could be taken to be a subject of self-evident importance and centrality. Now, today, I think it's fair to say that it's far from self-evident that the proper subject for British historians is British history, and still less that history is past politics and politics present history. Stubbs's course has gone, more or less. Stubbs's select charters, his constitutional history, and his other works were last reprinted in the 1960s. The constitutionalist, nationalist narrative he helped to inculcate has died, and it has not been replaced by any new single national story. There are countless histories of modern Britain, begins one recent introduction, one provocative introduction to the subject. Countless histories of modern Britain, but little agreement about what it was, when it was, where it happened, who was part of it, or how it should be told. The promise of this benefaction, the chair in modern British political history that is being so generously promised here, consequently comes at a pivotal moment in our discipline and in our institution. Oxford remains one of the great centres for the study of British history, but the variety of approaches taken, the divergences of focus reveal just how polymorphous and how protean the subject has become. To take the books produced by members of the faculty for the last 2 or 3 years, by way of example, we can see that in the shape, not least, of Keble's own Angus Hawkins, there is still an ongoing, indeed a renewed, tradition of British political history here. But his voice and that subject is only one of many. There are also, as you can see, academics writing about British history and defining Britain in a staggering assortment of different ways. They are writing about class and empire and education and religion and buildings and literature and art and thought and radicalism and gender and even Ireland, Europe, and the world beyond. And these, it's worth emphasising, are just the books that have been produced in the last 2 years or so. Were I to sample the deluge of articles, essays, and reviews produced by Oxford historians over the last 2 or 3 years, I'd be able to present an even more diverse and disorientating picture of our discipline as it now stands. This reveals the richness of our subject. It also shows just how far it has come and how far it has broadened and deepened from its original form and from the foundation myth that William Stubbs bequeathed us. But this has also been seen by many historians and writers on the subject as something of a problem. For it's not just Stubbs's heroic story of the English Constitution that has been sidelined. There's a sense that British history more generally is struggling to assert itself, to defend its importance and to justify its existence. There is a sense that we urgently need, in the minds of some, to pin down, to answer that question of what it was, when it was, where it happened, who was part of it, and how it should be told. For some writers, British history now seems too small scale, literally too insular. For others, it seems regressive to focus on national histories when transnational, comparative, and global stories seem more appropriate and more exciting. 30 years ago, in 1988, David Cannadine famously asked in Past and Present whether British history had a future at all. 10 years ago, the North American Conference on British Studies was the forum for another anguished and gloomy debate about what was described as the decline of British history. They concluded, rather glumly, that the challenge which confronts those of us who share a professional commitment to the study of British history is to demonstrate that we can respond in new and meaningful ways to an environment that has grown less and less favourable to any claims for the importance of that subject. The solution that the North American academics suggested was to go global, was to assert Britain's importance within a world historical framework. And many historians have followed that call and been attracted by that idea. In recent years, from the right, Jonathan Clarke has argued that Britain, and I quote, alone initiated the process we now call globalization. Yay us. And from the left, James Vernon has maintained that Britain somehow alone invented something he called modernity. Again, yay. These are seductive notions. And if Britain were indeed the pioneer nation they suggest, boldly forging the conditions of modern, global, and globalized society, then they would sustain claims about the central importance of British history, not just for British historians, but for everyone studying the modern world. But it's not hard to see that these British Sonderwegen are in many respects just a reheated version of Stubbs's Whig history. Another story in which, in other words, Britain taught the world, a recrudescence of Whiggism, all the more remarkable for being articulated by two historians, Clarke and Vernon, who made their names attacking the Whig interpretation of history, attacking Stubbs's claims for Britain's unique place as a source, a repository, an exemplar of progress. More crucially, it's not at all clear that simply switching focus from the insular to the global, from a Britain rooted in these islands to one broadcast across the world, actually helps address somewhat exaggerated fears about the future of our subject, or the very real questions about the nature of our subject. Nor does it get to grips with the crucial question of where the boundaries of British history actually lie. What I want to suggest instead is that aside from its intrinsic interest, the study of British history can be defended without recourse to these stories of exceptionalism or a sort of neo-Stubbsian notion of this island nation teaching all the world how to be modern, much less a panic-stricken sense that British history can only be saved by seeking it abroad. Rather, I want to make a more modest claim. British history has been the subject of serious scholarly study in Britain and specifically here in Oxford ever since the 19th century. That means we are able to draw upon a uniquely long, rich, and intensive historiographical tradition. The sheer profusion of the approaches we now possess is evidence of the way in which this enables British historians to experiment with our subject, to try out new methods, and to approach old sources in new ways. Far from demonstrating that British history has no future, variety is, I'd suggest, a sign of strength, proof not of dilution, diminution, or dissolution, but of the inherent life and strength of that ongoing tradition. More importantly still, the sheer variety of approaches means that any attempt to home in on a single theme, any attempt to suggest that British history is reducible to a single story of modernisation, democratisation, or globalisation, or any other sort of narrative, simply will not work. Because of the research that's gone on before us, we're increasingly able to transcend, or at any rate redefine, older categories of analysis to see, for instance, that political history is not only constitutional history, or British history only the story of those who remained in Britain. To see, in other words, that the key question, the most interesting and important question of British history is precisely what and where Britain is, and to recognise that far from being an existential crisis for our subject, that question of where Britain and what the boundaries of British history might be is instead a wonderful invitation to think as hard about the nature of history itself as about the form and function of British history in particular. And one way of doing that, not the only way, but one way of doing that is, I would want to suggest, is by thinking of history not so much in thematic categories or chronological ones or even national ones, but in scalar terms, as a question of scale, in other words. Scale is, of course, a familiar concept in geography. Indeed, the geographer Richard Whyte has argued that scale is the foundational concept of his subject. In geography, issues of scale enable scholars to link the local and the global, to analyse the personal, the regional, the national and the transnational, as well as to explore how their subjects understand and experience the world in which they live. Understanding life in terms of scale, as the geographer Andrew Herod argues, provides us with a sense of size, of power relationships, and of hierarchies. Historians, by contrast, as Josie McClellan recently observed, have barely touched upon the idea of scale as an analytical category, and modern British historians have almost completely ignored it. Yet the very fact that the nature, even the location of modern British history is disputable means that scale offers us, I think, a new and fertile way of reconceptualising our project as British historians. And, you'll be pleased to hear, Keble Chapel is a terrifically good place to start. It forms a focus, a meeting point, a juncture or conjunction even, for many different scales of history, from the subjective and personal to the truly international. As a building, as a project, as an idea, and as an influence, it exemplifies the value of scale, not just in general, but as a way of thinking about the nature of British history and historical research more generally. We might start, literally, with the building itself. It's an Oxford icon, of course, and a vision of a very particular Oxford. It's the product, as you all know, of the Oxford movement, of that campaign to reform the university and to revive the Catholic traditions of the Church of England. But it's an Oxford product in more ways than that narrow party label might suggest. Its location and its form places it not just within the university, but within the immediate locality, within North Oxford, part of that base and brackish skirt that the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins feared had soured the grey stone city of Oxford in the Victorian era. Keble was built to the north of the city, as you know, on the site of an old market garden, adorned, as Earl Beauchamp observed at the opening of the chapel, with currant trees and gooseberry bushes. This is a wonderful photo of the early 1860s, which shows you the site of the warden's house, that just there, the warden's lodgings, just there to the right, where those old trees are. A glimpse of North Oxford as it begins to move up Parks Road into what were, up until the 1850s, the wild, uncharted wastes of the north. It's noteworthy that people who lived in Parktown used to carry a gun with them because of the fear of being robbed on the way. In other words, Keble being here was just a small part of the transformation of the agricultural land of North Oxford into the suburban sprawl that we now know. This links Keble to a profound change in the city, the transformation of Oxford from a small, grey university town into the large brick and yellow sandstone city that we see today. change that you can see beautifully captured in this image of the building of Leckford Road. The exhaustion of local stone, the arrival of the canal and the railway, which enabled foreign stones and foreign bricks to take the city, the invention of new brick-making processes, the abolition of the brick tax, all this reshaped the local scale. The number of Oxford bricklayers increased by 147% in the decade between 1861 and 71. By 1881, Oxford had gained 83 brick-making yards in Cowley, in Headington, in Shotover, in Summertown. At Keble, the bricks were still handmade in a traditional way, but they utilised the newest and most innovative sorts of industrial kilns to achieve the finish, colour and precision that left visitors, in the words of the Building News, gazing on the chapel with much curiosity, if comparatively little hope. Keble's form and Keble's function were also a product of a distinctive Oxonian culture. This can be seen in the way that the college echoes other colleges and the way in which it challenges them. Brick was a challenge, of course, one that spoke of how Keble would be different. It spoke also of how it would be economical. It would not be luxurious. It would not be expensive. It would be, as Earl Beecham put it, an institution in which undergraduates should be able to live without being exposed to those temptations to extravagance and expense which undoubtedly exist in older foundations. It would be, in other words, Keble would be Oxford, but better than Oxford. Unlike the other colleges, all the students would live on site and all would eat in hall. The plan, this series of open quadrangles with the chapel, the largest and most important structure, this symbolised a reformed and explicitly Christian college, in contrast to the enclosed, inward-looking other colleges where chapel and hall were jammed together in a single, indistinguishable range. Keble's location and its design also linked the college to the rich religious geography, not just of Oxford, but also increasingly of North Oxford, of the churches, the convents, the women's colleges like LMH, founded, as the first warden of Keble said, as a kind of Keble for women. This was, as the vicar of St Philip in St James observed, North Oxford was a strikingly churchy, even a high church environment, and one that Keble suited well. It belonged, in other words, to this local scale, both in the form, in its function, and even in its materials. And just as it was distinguished from the university, so it also sought to distinguish itself from North Oxford. The new suburb, not least, was overwhelmingly female. As Keble was being built, the census records show that 75% of the inhabitants of North Oxford were women. Little wonder that the Oxford magazine included in the 1880s a satirical set of letters from North Oxford, describing a world filled with terrifying mythological figures and, still more frighteningly, women desperately seeking husbands, and frightened men escaping their advances through the parks. Little wonder, too, that when one woman went into Blackwell's in the 1890s and asked for a map of Oxford, she was told they had none for her. "We only have maps of Oxford," she said. "You will want a map of the suburbs." And little wonder, too, that Keble's architecture should speak of rugged masculine assertion, nor that from the first the college was keen to participate in aggressively masculine sports, which the first chaplain even went on to preach on the necessity of being good at rowing in amongst his first sermons in the chapel once it was consecrated. From its North Oxford site, Keble needed to assert its place against feminised North Oxford and more with the masculine world of the university. A world of bachelor dons, of nude swimming at Parsons' Pleasure here in 1906, and of other, more decorous homosocial activities. Keble's form and Keble's function is inexplicable aside from this local context as it seeks to navigate its position in relationship to the university and in relationship to the modern city that it was part of. But change the scale, alter the magnification, if you like, and we can see how Keble was also shaped and shaped national as well as local events and themes. As a foundation, it was not only intended to reflect Oxonian preoccupations. Its backers came from all over Britain, those 3,000 people who contributed to its foundation. It was first conceived of in Hampshire. The Keble Memorial Committee was based in London. The builders, the contractors who actually built this place, travelled south from Rugby, and its first students came from every county in the country. It was, as such, part of many overlapping and interconnecting national networks, networks made visible at the opening of the chapel, in the gathering of the great and the good, the rich and the powerful, the national names, the ministers, the bishops, the peers. This variegated attendance at that event in 1876 also speaks of the ways in which religion and politics intermeshed in Keble's foundation, for there was a politics and a political economy here, as well as an educational and religious impetus. The idea of this new and inexpensive Oxford College serving the needs of those poorer students who would not be safe and who would not be able to afford to go into the older institutions can be traced back a whole generation before Keble actually opened, back to the Oxford of the 1840s, and to 1846 to be precise, when Gladstone and Pusey and others supported an address on what was called university extension. Within 3 years of that address, by 1849 in other words, £3,000 had been raised, and this site had been promised a full generation before Keble was actually built for a college to attract and to support poorer students. The plan for this University Extension College was revived in 1866, as we know, as a result and in tribute to Keble in the year that he died. But much of the real impetus for that university extension, for that reform of the university and that widening reach of the university came 12 months later with the passing of the Second Reform Act. The sudden expansion of the electorate, the leap in the dark, as it was known, enfranchised a new and, it was believed, alarmingly ill-educated public. The Education Act of 1870, Forster's Act, which created universal elementary education and gave birth to a series of other bricky educational buildings, these lighthouses, these beacons of the future, as Sherlock Holmes described them. This was one response to the anxiety produced by the Second Reform Act. But there was also a response amongst the middle and the upper classes too. At Bristol in 1874, where plans for this, the University College, were unveiled, a college also intended to act as an extension of Oxford, also intended to recruit those who could not afford the education in the older colleges here. It was heralded. In Bristol in 1874, it was heralded by one of its chief backers, the Liberal MP Samuel Morley, in the following words. "It is for us," he said, "for the middle class to resolve that we will, instead of falling into the back rank, maintain our position of influence within the country. This we can only do by promoting the culture and intellectual advancement of our sons and daughters." What was being done in Bristol was also being done here. Keble was another example of this national trend, driven by political and social anxieties in a world where the franchise was widening. At a national scale, we can also link this building to the forest of new churches and chapels erected by the Victorians and wonderfully symbolised in this image by Pugin. This is his vision of Victorian England, how it should be. Gothic, full of churches and designed entirely by him. By the time Keble had acquired its chapel, the Church of England had built 3,000 or 4,000 other churches. In the decade before Keble opened, a new Anglican church was consecrated every 3 or 4 days. This reflected religious revival, of course, a religious revival shaped in large part by Keble and his fellow Tractarians. It also, as I've tried to show, reflected a new understanding of church architecture, a sense very powerfully expressed in Keble Chapel that buildings were not just the containers of religious worship, but actually missionaries in their own right. An ideal expressed in the Keble architect, William Butterfield's declaration that the chapel was less a building than the embodiment of Christian doctrine, with its ornamentation intended, as he went on, as a complete course in Christian history, and even its brickwork meant to convey theological principle. For Butterfield, for your architect, it was a moral and religious imperative that buildings should, as he put it, tell the truth. If built of brick, they should reveal that. If ornamented, that ornamentation should grow out of the materials. This structural polychromy, as it was called, had a moral, a religious purpose, an ideal illustrated here, but illustrated also in his other buildings, from Rugby School Chapel to the Church of All Saints, Margaret Street in London. At this national scale, we can also see that Keble was impossible and its structure unimaginable without the wider changes which were transforming Britain more generally. Although inspired by the architecture of medieval Christendom, Keble was a thoroughly modern building, complete with modern windows, central heating, sinks, cisterns, lofts, and as one journal put it, every other modern conveniences calculated to save trouble. It was built by modern builders, national figures, not local contractors, who used a steam winch, an early mechanical crane, to hoist materials up onto the roof of the chapel. Butterfield's greatest patron and fiercest critic, the MP Alexander Beresford Hope, so good they named him twice, asked a crucial question a decade before Keble Chapel was opened. Our public works and our public buildings become day to day more vast and more lofty, he wrote. In this modern world, the giant hotel replaces the gloomy and obscure tavern, and the public library shows into the shade the few hoarded volumes in the corner. The cramped stagecoach, with its handful of squeezed travellers, has been annihilated by the train with its hundreds of well-housed passengers. This is before Southern Rail. The intellectual expenditure of artistic invention and the physical expenditure equally characterise the structures of the day. Beresford Hope saw in this general trend of scale, elaboration, luxury, a general and particular challenge to the church. Shall God then only be forgotten, he went on? Shall we be told that we ought to make our homes and our town halls, our theatres and our hotels, our shops and our legislative chambers lofty and wide, glorious in painting and carved work, and glittering with costly materials? Shall we do all this, and the house of God alone be allowed to remain small and mean? Well, Rugby Chapel, All Saints Margaret Street, and Keble College were answers to these questions. And the answer was that in this modern world, religious buildings and religious life had to be every bit as impressive as the secular. Change the scale, however, again, alter our magnification, and other themes come into view. On an international scale, it would be easy to link this building with the other great revivalist religious architecture of the period, all of which exhibits exactly the same desire to build modern buildings in ancient forms that we see here in Keble. Butterfield himself owed his career to his work on St. Augustine's College in Canterbury, designed to dispatch missionaries throughout the British Empire. And even as he was building Keble, he was also responsible for oversight of the Anglican Cathedral in Melbourne. It's noteworthy, too, that the opening ceremonies for Keble Chapel had a distinctly imperial timbre to them. The worthies assembled at that great day in 1876 included the bishops of Petermaritzburg and the bishop designate of Bombay, the man who, as chaplain of the college, had preached on the necessity of rowing. The Chancellor, Lord Salisbury, his speech explicitly evoked his belief that the architecture of this college embodied a wholesome frugality in living, which was especially desirable in the England of the late 19th century. As the nation grows in wealth, he opined, luxury advances with more than equal strides, and if we are not careful, he said, our fate seems likely to be too nearly that which attends the rise of many an Eastern dynasty. An important phrase, as we know, in response to Queen Victoria being made Empress of India, but an important phrase more generally. Keble, for Salisbury, in other words, was a kind of way of opposing Orientalism and the Oriental luxury that he feared was gradually dragging the empire down. And Keble College and its chapel doesn't just evoke these imperial themes. As a foundation and as a work of architecture, it evokes and expresses the intermingling of ethics and aesthetics, religion and politics, modernity and historic revivalism that was similarly expressed in the Low Countries, in Germany, in Russia and elsewhere. One might also almost say that the entire world is covering itself with the vegetation of churches in the style of the Middle Ages, observed the French Annales Archéologiques in 1853. Keble, like the newly completed Cologne Cathedral, like the National Cathedral in Washington, even like the Cathedral of Saviour on the Blood in St. Petersburg, speaks of this international movement, this genuinely transnational trend of using historic architecture to embody modern buildings in a modern, nationalistic world. More tangibly, too, Keble Chapel would have been unthinkable without the overseas profits of its great benefactor, William Gibbs, the donor whose tens of thousands of pounds made it all possible. He was a Tractarian, a layman, and an enthusiast for all things medieval, as his house, Tinsfield, still reveals. I mean, you really would have to like the Middle Ages. He was also an international businessman. Indeed, it's been suggested by his biographer that his fondness for High Church Anglicanism was the product of his decade spent living and worshipping in the Iberian Peninsula. It was, in other words, Spain rather more than England, Seville rather more than Oxford, that inspired his love of neo-medievalism and his support for Anglo-Catholicism. And it was South America, of course, that paid for it all. Famously, the Gibbs money came from guano, or as traders in the London stock market used to sing, the House of Gibbs, they made their dibs, selling turds of foreign birds. This, though, was no laughing matter. In the improved experimental agricultural world of the mid-19th century, guano was seen as little more than a miracle fertilizer. William Gibbs owned the monopoly on the best guano in the world, the fertilizer dug out of the Chincha Islands belonging to Peru. The scale of the enterprise is extraordinary. Here are some of the mines on those islands. In the 2 decades before 1876, guano was the single largest commodity extracted from the whole of South America. In the years between 1855 and 1864, Britain received cargoes of guano worth up to £20 million and up to 700,000 tons of the stuff was imported annually, with the firm of Gibbs alone dispatching as many as 478 ships a year to carry the guano home. Not only did this pay for Keble College Chapel, not only did it transform this little bit of Oxford, the guano trade and the Gibbs family transformed Peru. The fertilizer business single-handedly sustained the Peruvian government. It paid for the abolition of slavery in Peru, for a 3% increase in all wages in Peru. It encouraged, countervailingly, the importation of Chinese indentured workers, basically slaves, to Peru. It underwrote the cost of a succession of wars with neighbouring states. More than this, the Gibbs family became the single biggest backers of the Peruvian state in this period, underwriting and providing loans which eventually reached a peak of £35 million by the time that Keble Chapel was opened. The chapel, in that sense, in this global scale, is linked fundamentally, irrevocably linked to the development of global capitalism, another international project for an international businessman, the head of a firm with other international projects in India and Turkey, Denmark, Brazil, China, Spain, Portugal, the United States, as well as Peru. All these different scales, the local, the national, and the international, provide different focuses, different magnifications that allow us to see this building in different ways, both in its local context, in its national one, and also more widely as part of international movements. And of course, I've not exhausted the range of themes or scales of analysis we might deploy. It's suggestive, for instance, that some who attended the opening of this chapel saw in it not an image of Oxford, nor an image of Britain, nor indeed an image of the empire, but rather, more personally, more subjectively, an image of Keble himself, with the mosaics and stained glass seen as an embodiment of the man and of the poetry that made him famous. The way in which different scales collide, or at least allied, is wonderfully exemplified by the reminiscences of one supporter at the laying of the college's foundation stone in 1868. George Selwyn, Bishop of Lichfield, and before that Bishop of New Zealand, was the inspiration of Keble's sister college, Selwyn, in Cambridge. Selwyn is another high church foundation designed to educate inexpensively in a suitably religious, suitably red brick fashion. For Bishop Selwyn, in his speech of 1868, Keble was a man and the college an institution which existed in multiple different scales. Keble's poetry, Selwyn recalled, was something that came down like a blessing on him as he served in his New Zealand see. The college, he continued, would be a similar blessing for his current see, for the poorer men of Lichfield. And it would be a blessing too for the University of Oxford and for the nation as a whole. In that way, Selwyn, in a single speech, brought together the personal, the local, the national, the global, these different scales of his experience. And in that way, he provides a final model for us too. Focusing on the different scales of modern British history allows us to make the sorts of creative connections and to rediscover the tangled mix of motives and influences that helped make up the past. It does not substitute the global for the national, or the national for the local, the micro for the macro, or any of these scales. It does not seek to make Britain an exemplar of modernity, of democracy, of globalization. It does not pin down the meaning or even the location of British history. Rather, using scale creatively is an invitation to new and original perspectives. Instead of policing the boundaries of British history or seeking to claim that Britain's history is uniquely important, I simply suggest that we seek to choose the right scale for our analysis. Sometimes that will be highly local. Sometimes it will be totally global. British historians do not, put simply, need to find an answer, much less the answer, to the question of what British history was, when it was, where it happened, who was part of it, and how it should be told. Indeed, each project we undertake will begin by asking those questions again, because British history can be anything, anywhere, about anyone, and told in any way. We just need to make sure that we've chosen the right scale to make those decisions, to push on with our project. What I urge then is that we should create a capacious, expansive, and inclusive definition of Britain and of British history, something that is intellectually defensible and something, I believe, that's politically vital too at the present time. It's thrilling to think that Keble will play a major part in this, and that a professor of modern British history will be able to join all of us here at Oxford as we explore these different scales of modern British history. Thank you very much.
I'm a DPhil student from history faculty, and last week we just had a workshop called Oxford and Empire, so to encourage undergrad students to write any thesis that telling the untold history of these kind of empire connections, and it's really good for you to illustrate Gibbs and his family, what kind of connection in Guiana. Maybe more critical question is, how do you think by studying architecture, that's your specialty, that itself, can we really critically analyze the colonial legacy existing in these colleges, and in what way can historians, modern British history, global history itself, can contribute to these kind of decolonization of knowledge or curriculum? Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. No, that's an extremely good question. I suppose the answer is twofold, really. I mean, the first is that architecture serves, and I mean, we need only think about the way in which the debate about the Rhodes Must Fall movement operated, or the way in which people have been discussing the Codrington Library. Architecture serves as a kind of classic, locus classicus, as it were, of the sort of lieu de mémoire. You know, here is a site of memory, here is a site that's constantly there reminding you. And sometimes that happens, but quite a lot of time it doesn't. And so what one finds is one looks at Keble, for example, and we can understand it within its British context really quite easily. But thinking about how it embodies some of those trade connections, how this is being paid for out of Peruvian money, that raises all sorts of interesting questions that go beyond purely representing empire and towards the way in which actually empire is just here. I suppose the second thing that makes architecture particularly appropriate for that is just architecture costs a lot. And as a result, when people build things, they have to think quite hard about what it is they're building, and they have to discuss it. And institutions are particularly good at giving records, of providing evidence of why certain things are built. And so what one can find is, in a single building, Keble would be a good example, but you could look at buildings all around Oxford in which you find both an attempt to represent the empire, and you also find buildings that could only exist as a result of the empire. And the records, the deposits, the evidence that you can mine for that is particularly good in institutions like this. And so one can find, and so the Oxford and Empire workshop, there's a rather wonderful example which I always like to use because it really irritates my old college, Wadham, which is as right on as you can humanly imagine. Right in the middle of the Wadham Antechapel is the memorial to a man who, we talked about it on last week, is a memorial to a man whose sole career was given over to defending slavery, the institution of slavery within the British Empire. And after having done that, after having failed at that, his sole career was determined to get money for slave owners. And there is the memorial, and it's been lost. Nobody recognises it, nobody knows who he is, but you recover that and suddenly you've got a visible, almost literally tangible connection to events that Oxford has very conveniently chosen to forget. Ooh, that's one.
How would adjusting the focus slightly from Britain to England speak to some of the things you've raised so fascinatingly?
Oh, that's a really brilliant, yes, because of course there is an extraordinary elision, even in stubs, between British history and English history, and what that actually means is a huge debate. It's a huge debate in the 19th century, and of course it remains a huge debate. I think sometimes in the 19th century, quite often, people just use England and the English to mean everywhere. And I mean, that's the classic A.J.P. Taylor definition, isn't it? In which he says, I intend to use English to mean everywhere, and when I don't, I'm going to use the word Scotch, because that is the word, and goodness knows where the Welsh fit into all this, much less the Irish. But there are interesting distinctions that are being made, and they're being made at the time between a conception of England and Englishness which is potentially global. And so Alfred Austin, the poet laureate at the end of the 19th century, in his Songs of England, says, I dedicate this to all people who thrill to the sound of England, all those people who speak English, that kind of great vision of a kind of Anglophone empire, or that great vision in which language becomes the main force of identity. And then there is a Britishness which is hung on to particularly by those people who are not English. And want to use that as a vehicle for creating a different sort of British, a different sort of set of identities. How would this help in Keble? Well, in Keble, the fundamental thing for them, I think, is their relationship to the Church of England. And that sense that this is the embodiment of a particular religio-political settlement, and the idea that Keble is somehow the inheritor of an uncorrupted Oxford tradition. And that then allows you to make quite interesting links between what's happening in the other new colleges of the late 19th century, where you see, for example, at Mansfield, exactly the same argument being made by the Congregationalists, who say, here we are, and in their wonderful chapel, nearly as wonderful as Keble, not quite, but the wonderful chapel, which is now the dining hall at Mansfield, which is an attempt to present the Congregationalists as part of the universal church. I think it's the only chapel I know of the Congregationalists that has statues of popes, and it's certainly the only church I know which has a stained glass window devoted to Plato, which is an unusual thing to find. Plato and St. Paul next to each other. And they're making the same argument. They're saying that the original Oxford was an Oxford which was open and capacious and uncorrupt. And what happens is, either at the Reformation or at the expulsion of the nonconformists in the 17th century, something goes wrong with Oxford. And that's to do with the Church of England, I think.